Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'd just like to give you an outline of what we propose doing this evening. The evening will commence with greetings by Judge Gabriel Bach. It will be followed by Professor Wistrich, comments by myself, and questions. I can assure you that this evening is going to be a very interesting and stimulating evening, and I look forward to having a lot of exchange and dialogue with all of you, all of us together. Let me first call on Judge Bach, and I'd like to introduce him with a few words. Judge Gabriel Bach was born in Germany in 1927, educated in Berlin, Amsterdam and Jerusalem, and studied law in England, receiving his LLB honours at University College London. He was called to the bar in 1950 at Lincoln's Inn, where he was awarded the Buchanan Prize as the best candidate of the year. In 2000, he was awarded a fellowship of University College, and he is today the only Israeli graduate holding the title of fellow at this university. Judge Bach was appointed state attorney in 1969. He served as legal advisor to the police during the Eichmann trial and acted as one of the prosecutors. He was involved in many well-known international criminal, civil and espionage cases. These included the Rohan case, that's the burning of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Meir Lansky case, the case involving Rabbi Kahana, Archbishop Capucci's trial, as well as many cases of constitutional law. He has also represented Israel in foreign courts and at international conferences. As state attorney, he was responsible for all the attorneys, including district attorneys, and represented the state in all litigation to which the state was a party, criminal and in civil cases alike. In March 1982, he was appointed Justice of the Israel Supreme Court, a position he held until 1997 when he reached mandatory retirement age. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce you to Judge Bach.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mr. Leibler. Best greetings to you all. First of all, Professor Wistrich himself, and then all the graduates of University College, where we are members of what is called the Association of the Graduates of University College. And best regards to the leaders of that group, which was formed in 1996. We had the first meeting, maybe many of you will remember that, of the graduates, and there are now about more than 400 of those of University College in Israel. And we had then our first meeting, which was attended by the Lord Chief Justice of England, later Harry Wolff, and the President of the State of Israel, Mr. Herzog, who unfortunately died about a year after that. And since then, this group is meeting regularly, and we have very interesting lectures. And it is a particular pleasure to meet today also Professor Wistrich, who is who in the 70s became his doctorate at University College London, professor. And well, when sometimes someone is mentioned as being an expert on the subject that he will talk about, at this time the anti-Semitism, in England, but altogether, then then one thinks he's one of the people who is an expert. But I can tell you that from all that I've heard about him and read, Professor Wistrich is really one of the leading figures in this topic that we are going to hear about. He holds now the Neuberger chair of modern European and Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem since 1989. And since 2002, he has also headed the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Hebrew University. Now, he, as you know, he's going to talk. Just before I go into that, I just would like to add that not only has he written a lot of books, about over 25 books, but he has also received terrific prizes for all those. Some of them has been, the last one has been described as the best book of the year on this topic. And he was very, very active in lots of universities in so many countries, in England and in America and in Austria and in Germany and in lots of other places. So he's really the person who we were interested to hear this lecture about. Now, when I read here about the from blood libel to boycott, this question of the boycott in England, I don't know, many of you, those who studied, I don't know, there's something that I just cannot grasp. One of the first things I learned when I studied law in England was the freedom of speech, freedom of sight. I mean, even if you disagree violently with someone, that was the first thing we were taught at university college, that whatever someone expresses, you should give him the freedom of speech. So therefore, when I heard that in some universities in England, they've decided to declare a boycott against professors coming or legal experts coming from Israel, because they don't agree with the policy of the state of Israel. Of course, they're entitled to criticize whatever they want, but to declare a boycott, I mean, that was something which is still, to me, is somehow incredible. The only consolation I have, and I think many of you will have, that there was a terrific opposition to this boycott by our college, University College London. They disagreed and they really objected to this. And actually from the start, we really felt that we were in a friendly society and atmosphere. I must say that every day that I studied at University College London, I felt that people wanted me to feel at home, and I heard that actually also during some of the days of crisis in relationship, let's say, with some of the British public, that these people were all the time fighting against this kind of anti-Semitism. I must also tell you, I mean, I was there for more than 3 years. After I was called to the bar, I worked for a year in the chambers of Mr. David Weitzman, who was a Queen's Councillor, and he was a member of Parliament, a member of the Labour Party. That was at the time of the very narrow Labour majority. And the whip of at Parliament forced all the Labour members to be there every evening to prevent a snap division by the Conservatives that they wanted to bring down the government. So I'm telling this because we had to prepare our cases, he and myself, at the law library of the House of Commons. When there was an interesting debate, Churchill was still alive, we used to go there, and I also helped him prepare his speeches. So for a year, I lived through this development and the combination of legal and political life of England. So I really came to know many of the problems that we are confronted with today. So I personally must say that I've never experienced real anti-Semitism in England, except once. When I finished my university, as a graduate, I was asked to do a thesis on the death penalty. And I collected a number of students, and we visited some prisons and some people, and I spent a whole night with someone who was sentenced to death before he was executed. And well, we visited one prison, a modern prison, and there, when we came in and we met the governor, and the governor said, he asked us, all of us, where we came from. He asked me first, I was the chairman of that group. He said, "Where do you come from?" I said, "From Israel." He said, "Oh, how awful." So I said, "Excuse me, why, what did you say?" He said, "Awful, I can't stand Jews. You know, whenever a Jew comes into my prison, I feel that I am the prisoner. He knows exactly what his rights are, and he always threatens that he's going to complain to the prison governor about this thing. So whenever he says, then I feel that I'm the sort of prisoner." And he said, "And you know, all these Jewish Polish murderers." Now, I didn't know all the cases, but I knew about the Polish cases. There were people from the Anders army. Definitely, I knew every case, and certainly not Jews. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. So I said, "Look, I'm not going to discuss the question of what you said just now, but, you know, these Polish murderers, they were not Jews." I said, "Mind you, they don't say they're Jews. They say they're non-Jews, but they must be. They're awful." Well, I didn't feel that. So then finally he said, "Tell me, what are prison conditions like in Israel now?" I said, "Well, you can imagine, after the mismanagement of colonial administration." I said, we are now trying to put some more enlightened spirit into our prison system. But then I remembered I was still inside the prison. So I somehow made a peace with him. And therefore, but as I say, that was really an exception. And well, but anyway, the whole of this problem that one hears sometimes, I also must say, I once met a Jewish person in London, and he said, "I'm very proud of my son." I said, "Why are you so proud?" He said, "Well, they refused to let him take part in a cricket club, the cricket club, and he slapped the face of someone who forbade him to come in, and I'm so proud that he slapped." Well, all right that he slapped his face, but you know, then I thought, well, how pleased I am and how proud I am and how satisfied I am that my children don't stand before that problem, that they don't have to slap anyone's face for being Jewish in their school. But as I said, I cannot say anything really my personal experience until every time I mentioned, well, people of the judges and lawyers and attorneys and well, prosecutors and others and politicians. I mean, I always had the most wonderful reception and really cordial, not only from the outside. I was invited to private homes, and I must say that I only can give a positive report of what my personal experience was. But it will be really of specific interest, I think, to all of us to hear what Professor Wistrich has to say and to tell us and to disclose to us about this problem, which is really has become a problem not only for people in England, but I think for people well, all over the world, but especially here. Now, therefore, please, Professor Wistrich, take the floor.
Thank you, Judge Bach. I'm not going to just duplicate what's been said, but let me just try and summarize, although it's for this audience, I'm sure it's not necessary, but I would differ respectfully with one statement that the judge made. He said that Professor Wistrich is one of the greatest experts on anti-Semitism. From my point of view, as a person that's been involved both in public life and to a limited extent in studies in anti-Semitism, he's the number one expert without any question in the field of anti-Semitism. Professor Wistrich has held the Neuberger Chair of Modern European and Jewish History at the Hebrew University since 1989. Since 2002, he also headed the Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and as has been pointed out, He was the first holder of the Jewish Chronicle Chair for Jewish Studies at University College London. He spent sabbaticals at Oxford, Harvard, Brandeis, and the Royal Netherlands Institute of Research, and taught at the École de Sciences Sociales in Paris, the University of Montpellier, and the University of Vienna and Yale. He's author of 25 books, some of which, like Anti-Semitism, The Longest Hatred, won international prizes. And I take enormous pride in the fact that I've got or read all of his books. His recent magnum opus, A Lethal Obsession, Anti-Semitism from Antiquity to the Global Jihad, was hailed by many commentators as a definitive work on the subject and was recently awarded the Best Book of the Year prize by the editors of the New York-based Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism, which described Professor Wistrich as the leading scholar in the field of anti-Semitism study, a view which most people engaged in dealing with anti-Semitism would undoubtedly endorse. It's my great honour and pleasure to invite the Professor to address us.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Izzy, for those very warm words. I'd be the last person that would publicly disagree with you. It wouldn't be polite in these circumstances. And thank you, Justice Bach, for your words of introduction, and to the University College Israel Alumni Association for having invited me to give this talk, which is taking place, as you can see, at the Hebrew University under the auspices of the Vidal Sassoon International Center. And I would equally like to thank my colleagues, Ruchama Roth, and all of the team at our institution for having, as usual, impeccably organized this event. Since this is an opportunity to see faces, for the most part, that I don't recall from my period at University College, I would like to say briefly a few words about my own experience during the 4.5 years that I held the position of Jewish Chronicle professor at University College London. That was 20 years ago. And that was a very different time in Britain. This is probably the point where I can echo, to a degree, what you, Judge Bach, told us about the very congenial reception that you received among colleagues in British academia. I think I would say that during those years, 1991 to the middle of 1995, I experienced something similar. But that was probably, when I look back on the many years that I grew up and lived in England, that was, if anything, the lull before the storm. It was an unusually, I would say, quiet period. The only incident that I recall in those years where I was called upon to confront directly the issue of anti-Semitism was around 1993, when a delegation of Jewish students at University College came to me and asked me to intercede with the then provost of University College, Dr. Derek Roberts, whom some of you may remember, because there were posters around the campus which had been placed there by a jihadist organization, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Party of Liberation, which were actually, among other things, violently and blatantly anti-Semitic. This organization favors the restoration of the Islamic Caliphate, the imposition of Sharia law. It is against Western democracy. And you only have to go to its website to see what it thinks about Jews. And the poster in question revived that now much used hadith about going to seek the Jew who is hiding behind the tree. O Muslim, if you find him, kill him. And this was actually on the poster. And so I approached the provost and I said, this is an outrage, and would you please do something to have this removed and to prevent, under any circumstances, any gathering taking place in the confines of this university by this organization, which is not prohibited to this day on British campuses, despite the fact that there are people, for instance, in the Conservative Party who have called for it. Obviously, Jewish community is well aware of it and has publicized it. To this day, to the best of my knowledge, the British government has not banned Hizb ut-Tahrir, despite the fact that this organization is banned in Germany and in Egypt, for that matter. We'll see how long that lasts. When we invoke the subject of British anti-Semitism, it's interesting to me to reflect in retrospect that when I published my first book specifically about anti-Semitism, The Longest Hatred, to which Izzy Leibler made reference, that book was published in 1991. It was about 350 pages, as I recall. There was one chapter on Great Britain. And I think that statistically, that chapter represented about 3% of this overall survey of anti-Semitism through history as it existed up until 1990. 3%. In my last book, A Lethal Obsession, which is just over 1,000 pages, there are 2 chapters on Britain, and just before coming here tonight, I did a rough calculation. How much did I devote to Great Britain? In this book in 2011, 20 years later, my calculation was 10%. From 3% to 10%, which I think is roughly right from a global perspective. But that's a very considerable and dramatic increase, larger than for any other single country in the elapse of 20 years. So something fundamental is changing and has changed. And that's just one small measure. I could probably think of many, many more indications. And perhaps this is the moment to mention another symptom. A fellow historian and colleague of mine, Anthony Julius, who has published a very important and perhaps a definitive work on the subject of British anti-Semitism, Trials of the Diaspora, a long book. The fact that he could publish a book of 800 pages plus solely on the topic of English anti-Semitism is something that I believe 20 years ago would have been inconceivable. So that too is an indication that things have changed. The first and most obvious point to be made about English anti-Semitism is its longevity. Of course, anti-Semitism itself is over 2,000 years old. But English or British, I don't want to get too much into that distinction, but I will focus primarily and overwhelmingly on English anti-Semitism, although of course it exists in Scotland and Wales and Ireland, is at least 1,000 years old. So that is a very substantial period of time. And the first model of English anti-Semitism, which takes us back to the Middle Ages roughly speaking, during the medieval period, the Jews of England, who were there from more or less the Norman conquest of 1066 until their expulsion by Edward I in 1290. That period was undoubtedly, to this day, the most lethal of all the periods that Anglo Jewry, if we can use that term a bit anachronistically, ever experienced. It was a time in which they experienced defamation, expropriation of all their wealth by the time that they were coming closer to the expulsion edict, and of course the blood libel, which I will address shortly. I say, by the way, that I just published in the format of the Posen Papers, a paper which is out there for those who are interested, which has the exact title of this lecture, but is very different. Don't worry about that. You know, I don't believe that a written paper and an oral delivery should be identical. But they complement each other. So whatever I'm saying tonight, take it as an addition, an interpretation maybe even of some of the things I've chosen to expound on in the written version. Medieval English society was a persecuting society in general terms, but the Jews of England were a particularly inviting target. Their status, as elsewhere in medieval Europe, was that of being the king's chattels. They were basically entirely dependent on the crown. And the crown used them as a kind of royal milch cow. They were there to be squeezed. They fulfilled certain functions, economic functions. They were often tax gatherers, unpopular functions. And they were indispensable to the royal exchequer, and particularly to kings who in England as elsewhere during the Middle Ages were bent on waging war. But they were equally indispensable as a scapegoat that could be thrown to popular anger. Popular anger, among other things, at usury, but discontent of all kinds. Now, when I was at school, and even later at university, and my first university was Cambridge. Afterwards, I did my doctorate at University College London. We heard nothing about this story of medieval Jewry. We heard a lot about the Crusades. Crusades were a big subject. And every English schoolboy, I'm sure this is true even to this day, knows the story of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, Coeur de Lion, the great crusader. And how many historians even of medieval England, and it's a very popular subject in England, how many know that on Richard I's coronation in 1189, the Jews of London were plundered, attacked, killed? A pogrom greeted the coronation of Richard I. My first direct experience of medieval anti-Semitism came in 1990. Of course, retrospective. When I was involved in the making of a film that was largely based on my book, The Longest Hatred. It's a 3-hour film about the history of anti-Semitism. And we went up to York, the city of York in northern England. And there was a ceremony taking place in 1990 to celebrate, quote unquote, 800 years since the massacre of Jews in York. 800 years. In the year 1190, a year after that coronation I just mentioned, and the pogrom which greeted it, over 150 Jews were massacred in the city of York. And we began the film with this ceremony, which was actually a reconciliation ceremony, which took place in a cathedral in York, a very important cathedral in Britain. And they had a ceremony with candles for the dead, the martyred dead. And the shofar was heard in this cathedral. It was a gesture of goodwill. One which I'm not so sure would take place today. This medieval history brings me to the bloodline. And we have to remember that this story, which has had such atrocious consequences in Jewish history, of the alleged killing of Christian children, by and large, young Christian children, and the use of their blood for religious, ritual purposes, or sometimes medicinal purposes, various examples of that. It began in England. England can claim not only precedence, it can claim to be the first country in the Christian world which invented and propagated the blood libel. And what is extraordinary is this took place for the first time in 1144 in the city of Norwich. And it was the story of a young boy, William, who later becomes Saint William, the martyr Saint William. And it was alleged that he was seized, kidnapped, and then subjected to the most awful tortures and killed by the Jews of Norwich. And this story became widely known a few years later when a Benedictine monk called Thomas of Monmouth, possibly a Welshman, wrote it up in great detail, in lurid detail. And Thomas of Monmouth presents the story of the horrific sufferings and martyrdom of young William as being a conspiracy of Jews. It's very interesting that we see already at the very origins of the blood libel that it is welded together with a conspiracy theory. Normally, we attribute that to a much more modern period. And Thomas of Monmouth tells us that he learned these details from a converted Jew called Theobald, who explained to him that the Jews in Spain, that they have a sort of conclave, and they meet in the city of Narbonne, and they decide there that each year a Christian should be sacrificed, a blood sacrifice. And in this specific case, the lot, the poor, the lot, had fallen on Norwich, and the Jews of Norwich were therefore under an obligation to provide their contribution to this, if you like, ritualized murder. And Thomas of Monmouth goes into considerable detail about this. And there's another interesting touch, which is that the reason why the Jews embark upon this, this extraordinary crucifixion murder is probably the best term. And here I recommend to you a book that our centre has just published by Darren O'Brien on the blood libel, which gives a great deal of documentation across Europe, but also includes the English case, where he explains that really we need to be careful about not mixing up ritual murder and crucifixion murder, even though sometimes they do indeed overlap. The point about the crucifixion murder, and this was certainly the case of William, is that the Jews carry this out as a reenactment of the original crucifixion. And they do it out of an implacable desire for vengeance and a compulsion to constantly reenact the crucifixion of our Lord, the passion of our Lord. And that's the way and the language of the Middle Ages. And there's another motif which is recorded by Thomas of Monmouth, namely that the Jews are also taking revenge for the loss of their homeland, for their exile. And according to the Christian interpretation, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the exile of the Jews, the loss of the temple, loss of sovereignty, loss of homeland, was a punishment for the crucifixion. And here we have a convoluted theory that the Jews now reenacted the crucifixion because they're taking vengeance on the Christians who are being blamed for their loss of the homeland, although obviously that is not the case. And this is how it appears in this account. In England, not only is there the case of Norwich, but immediately a kind of epidemic of blood libel cases. Gloucester, Bury St. Edmunds. And then later in the 13th century, London, Northampton, and the most notorious of all the blood libel cases in 1255 of young Hugh of Lincoln, an 8-year-old boy who was allegedly captured, excruciating tortures and suffering and agonies that he had to endure, all of them set out in glaring detail. And Hugh of Lincoln, I first encountered as a schoolboy in English literature. I studied English literature to advanced level in England. And on our syllabus, I'm quite sure this is still true today, the classic of medieval literature is the work of Geoffrey Chaucer, The Canterbury Tales, which is a masterpiece. It's Anglo-Saxon, so you need a dictionary, but you learn to read it. And Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales between 1389 and 1400. So it's the end of the 14th century. And there is one tale in there, the Prioress's Tale, which is about the blood libel and the story of Hugh. Saint Hugh, of course, he becomes Saint Hugh just as William became Saint William. And this, in the form of ballads and songs, gradually extended. England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, France, United States, quite often quoted in anti-Semitic literature much later. So if we look at the medieval period as a whole, to sum up this episode, what do we see? We see England's invention of the blood libel, a really deadly invention that is going to echo down the centuries into the 20th century and even into our own time, where it's found a new home in the Muslim world. Lock, stock and barrel, picked up and widely disseminated. England invents this libel. And it is widely believed. It has, and this is one of, I think, the important things that we find in Anthony Julius's book, it's an original contribution on his part to trace its impact in English literature. The three canonical writers of English literature, looked at in the broadest sense, are Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Dickens. In Chaucer, we have the blood libel. Of course, we have many, many other things. Otherwise, we'll hardly be considered the great writer. And similarly, with regard to Shakespeare. And I don't want to get into a polemic which would be endless, because this subject is endless, about whether Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice is an anti-Semitic text or not. Because from my perspective, that doesn't really matter. What does matter very much is that the figure of Shylock became an emblematic figure in the history of anti-Semitism. That Shylock became a code word, a summation of certain qualities, negative qualities, attributed to the Jew or Jews. The Jew as vengeful, as tribal, as a blood-sucking usurer. The Jew demanding his pound of flesh. Today, in a lot of so-called anti-Zionist literature in England and elsewhere, you find endless plays on the Shylock image, the rapacious, blood-sucking, and cruel, vengeful Jew. Cruelty, attributed to the Jews as an endemic trait, which clearly has medieval origins, has carried through. And in England, it has carried through as much as anywhere. And you find it in literature. And Dickens, Oliver Twist, and the character of Fagin, Dickens wrote this in the late 1830s. Again, it's not important to me so much whether Dickens was an anti-Semite. He actually issued a kind of mea culpa and tried to correct, when it was pointed out to him, the damage that this image of the criminal Fagin and the associations of Jews, children, murder, and so on, how destructive this could be. But most of the great English authors that I read and studied, and many of them I enjoyed, I confess, were, I would say, almost inevitably, given the power and the weight of this literary tradition, they reproduce a whole range, a whole array of stereotypes and, in some cases, libels against the Jews. On the syllabus that I studied in the 1960s at school, almost every author that was on that syllabus engaged or indulged himself in this exercise. That included writers, more modern writers, like Anthony Trollope, Thackeray, Galsworthy, H.G. Wells, T.S. Eliot, and D.H. Lawrence. The only author I can think of on our syllabus who didn't quite fall into this category would be George Orwell. And even George Orwell was highly ambiguous in his early years on the subject of Jews, although he wrote a very perceptive essay on English anti-Semitism around 1943, by which time perhaps he thought better of some of his own earlier notions. The extraordinary thing is that when the Jews are finally expelled in 1290, you might have expected, rationally speaking, that anti-Semitism would gradually fade away. No Jews, no physical presence. The Jews of England do not return, certainly officially they don't return to British shores until the late 1650s. And even then, it's only a tiny trickle at the beginning. So they are absent from England for 350 to 400 years. And yet we know other studies have shown that in that period of physical absence, all of the stereotypes and the blood libel and everything attached to it continue to thrive in ballads, in folklore, in medieval sermons, and above all in the literature. The poets and the dramatists, they kept the flame alive. So that Elizabethan England, with its great culture, and not a single Jew officially on British soil, produces not just Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, but more interestingly, another text by Christopher Marlowe, The Jew of Malta, in which this Jew is an omnipotent, devilish Jew, all-powerful, Barabbas, and no Jews in England. Of course, we've learned to understand a little better this phenomenon of anti-Semitism without Jews. When the Jews return, there are a number of myths around the story. The usual version that I'm familiar with, that was held for a long time, is that it was an act of a sort of inauguration of tolerance in the late years of Cromwell's ascendancy. And I will come back in a minute to another side of the English approach to Jews, which is extremely important, not least to us in Israel. The fact is the Jews were not really invited back. It was a much more piecemeal, one step forward, one step back process. There was a great deal of resistance to the readmission of the Jews to England. Cromwell was favorable, both for commercial and religious reasons. He clearly saw the advantages to England of having commercially successful Jews who were serving the Dutch rivals. And of course, as the leader of the Puritan Revolution in England, and the one and only time that England established a republic, as someone seeped in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, Cromwell was open to persuasion. Nevertheless, it was quite a difficult process of re-establishing the Jewish presence in England. But since I mentioned Cromwell, I think I have to say something about England from the 17th century and a significant change in attitudes to Jews. Not a clear-cut break with the past, but nevertheless, something which has characterized English history and arguably without which Zionism as we know it in its current form might not have taken the form it did. Because there is no doubt that 17th century England, we see the beginnings of a process whereby the British Isles become the most Bible-reading Christian nation anywhere in the world. It began already in Elizabethan England, it has to be said, but in the 17th century, we see an extraordinary identification with the biblical Israel. A vast array of pamphlets, of books, which talk about even about the need to restore Israel to its promised land in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Important people write such pamphlets. In 1621, Sir Henry Finch, who was an MP, wrote a book like this, which very much displeased James the First. And of course, James the First has his name to the authorized translation of the Hebrew Bible into English. And this authorized translation has had an immense impact on the English-speaking peoples and, of course, on Great Britain itself. An impact that I would say lasted more or less, because I think we can now speak in the past tense. It lasted roughly from about 1620s until the 1950s, which is 300 plus years. And Christian Zionism, which is an important factor in today's world, but primarily associated, and rightly so, with the United States, has its birth and its origins in England. This strand could even be defined, and some historians have done this, as a philo-Semitic trend that exists in English culture. So it has to be set against the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic trends. And yet we have to be careful not to assume that this strand of Bible-loving, Protestant, British Protestant belief in the need to fulfill the biblical prophecies and even a special mission towards the Jews, we have to be careful not to assume that it is necessarily inconsistent with holding beliefs about Jews that are in some ways also anti-Jewish. It's not a clear-cut black and white thing. Above all, because in the evangelical Protestant tradition, we are talking about a Hebrew or Jewish nation converted to Christianity. The point of the restoration, ultimately, is that it will detonate, it will trigger off the much wished for conversion of the Jews in the fullness of time, and it will bring about the final redemption. Be that as it may, we should not jump into the opposite extreme, which is now very fashionable in historiography, which is to brand the Christian Zionists with a very broad brush, as if they are anti-Semites under a philo-Semitic facade. There are some grotesque examples that I've come across recently, and they usually come from Jewish anti-Zionists. One example is in Tom Segev's book about One Palestine, the Mandate, where he discusses the question of Arthur James Balfour. Now, everybody knows that Balfour's name is forever tied to the Balfour Declaration, and there's even a Balfour Street here in Jerusalem. Arthur James Balfour was a Scottish aristocrat who came from a Bible-loving, covenanteering tradition. And certainly, he believed not only that Christendom, and Britain as well, owed a special debt to the Jews, and that the restoration of the Jewish people to Zion was a debt that had to be paid, and that this was a privilege for Britain, so to speak, that it was in a position at the height of its imperial power to fulfill this debt. At the same time, it is true that if you examine some of Balfour's thinking about Jews before the Declaration, and even at the time that he was Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister of Britain, after 1902, the Aliens Act was passed under his premiership. The Aliens Act draconically restricted Jewish immigration into Great Britain. And we know that Balfour believed sincerely that it would not be a good idea for Britain to encourage the immigration, mass immigration of Jews, because their character was distinct and their very abilities, their industry, their skills would be such that this would somehow disturb, as it were, the national character and culture. They were a people apart. It's fundamental to Balfour's thinking. They did not intermarry. Their character was so deeply, as it were, embedded that he did not think assimilation was feasible practically with a large critical mass of Jews. You could say there's a logic in his Zionism here as well. But to jump from that, as Tom Segev did, and say that Balfour's Zionism was a function of his bigotry, of his prejudice, I mean, these are his words, right? And belief that the Jews run the world. This is just, I would say, off beam. This is not true. What is true is there was an element of anti-Semitism. It was a mild, a fairly benign, I don't want to go too far because the Aliens Bill is what it was, but the Zionism didn't come from there, in my view. It didn't contradict the other thing either. If you look at some of the other architects of the Balfour Declaration and the idea of the Jewish national home, all of the people in the British War Cabinet in 1917 who made that decision, which was largely a secret decision, in the sense that it wasn't, authorized by Parliament or even by the larger cabinet, they were all Protestant nonconformists of one kind or another. The most important was David Lloyd George. Prime Minister of Britain, we have to say almost by divine providence, if we want to look at it that way, that this man should become Prime Minister of Britain in 1916, 1 year before the Declaration, because his predecessor, Asquith, would never in 1,000 years have consented to either to the British conquest of Palestine, which was indispensable for the subsequent history, or to the Declaration. But if you look at the other, and Lloyd George was a Welshman from a dissenting background who knew, as he himself said, he knew the history and the geography of Palestine much better than that of his own country. He was, I think, a Methodist lay preacher. And look at the other important names. Milner, Cecil, Jan Smuts, who was a South African, but was a very enthusiastic, passionate advocate of Zionism. So this was an extraordinary moment. And the interesting thing is that the one Jewish member of the cabinet who totally opposed the Balfour Declaration, Edwin Montagu, he wrote a memorandum to Lloyd George and to the cabinet, protesting against what he called, was entitled the anti-Semitism of the British government. Because for Montagu, what the Balfour Declaration, the whole idea of a Jewish national home meant was calling into question the status of the Jews in Great Britain, calling into doubt their loyalties. And God's gift to anti-Semitism, this was the argument. A declaration in favor of Zionism is exactly what the anti-Semites are waiting for. And of course, more privately, Montagu made a point, and he had a point, how can I exercise my functions as the Secretary of State for India with its millions of Muslims when I'm associated with a government that has just announced that it views with favor the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine? I want to backtrack just a moment. It's often said that in the 19th century, as Britain achieves its status of being, we could say, the superpower of its day, the British Empire is an empire in which the sun supposedly will never set. And Anglo-Jews are proud, as indeed they might well be, of their citizenship of this great empire. And they finally, in 1858, received their emancipation, at least most of their emancipation. Strictly speaking, that is not completed even until 1870, which is late. But in 1858, finally, Lionel Rothschild is allowed to take his seat in the House of Commons. After having tried 3 previous times, he was elected, but he could not take his seat because you had to take your seat on the oath of a Christian gentleman, which he was not prepared to do. And the emancipation is there. Anglo-Jews are feeling now that perhaps they've never had it so good. And then comes another spectacular episode in the history of Anglo-Jewry, the second ministry of Benjamin Disraeli, one of the most astonishing personalities and political phenomena, certainly of British history and more widely, I would say. Very often it was alleged that Disraeli's success was the proof that England was the ideal liberal society with its tolerance, that even a Jew could become the prime minister of this great empire. And in 1874 to 1880, Disraeli, in his second ministry as prime minister, becomes a pivotal figure in international diplomacy. England is run by a Jew. Now, what kind of a Jew? This man was converted, as we all know, at the age of 13 or thereabouts. And of course, had he not been converted, there is no way on earth or heaven that he could have become prime minister of Great Britain because he couldn't even have sat in Parliament. And he began his career in the 1830s, his political career. And of course, he was surrounded, and this part of the story for a long time, I would say only in the last 20 years or so, there's been a revision of this. He was surrounded by extraordinary hostility. Certainly by the time he becomes Prime Minister. We see a level of anti-Semitism of the modern and even racial kind directed at Disraeli and what he represents. And what's interesting about the English response is that despite his conversion, despite his very, I would say, public Anglicanism, the importance he attaches to religion, despite his patriotism, his hyper-patriotism, even jingoism, Disraeli, as Prime Minister, is attacked, and often viciously, as the Jew. Every epithet you can imagine, Fagin, Shylock, the Jew Earl, he became Earl of Beaconsfield, the abominable Jew, the caricatures, the cartoons in Punch and many other publications in Britain, often present him as satanic. Every aspect of Disraeli's persona, Oriental, Asiatic, Semitic, in the worst possible sense. Un-English, that's the killer. The un-English Disraeli. And this man was extraordinarily patriotic and, amazing in retrospect, the leader of the Tory party, a party of the landed aristocracy, a party that was known for its prejudices and distaste for Jews. Even Disraeli sometimes commented in amazement at the fact that he had somehow engineered this unbelievable feat of becoming the leader of the English Tory party. And who are the people that attack him in an anti-Semitic way? First and foremost, and this is important for the present, first and foremost, they are liberals, they are nonconformists, and they are radicals. Of course, there's also some opposition in the Conservative Party, but it's muted. And that's interesting. Even his most formidable opponent, the legendary opponent, William Gladstone, 4 times Prime Minister of England, Gladstone does not refrain from what I would consider today certainly as anti-Semitic comments. And all of this comes to a head over the Eastern question. And here again we have an extraordinary reversal, because the issue that focuses like a magnet all of the anti-Semitism in England against Disraeli, and by implication against English Jews, is the defense of Muslim Turkey against Russia, and Disraeli's position of more or less ignoring what were called the Bulgarian massacres in 1877-78. The Turks, who are still with a strong foothold in the Balkans, repress Bulgarian efforts at independence. We're talking about Eastern Orthodox Christians who are being put to the sword by Muslim Turks. And Disraeli more or less brushes this off and reaffirms what had been the traditional British foreign policy. He didn't invent this, of maintaining the Ottoman Empire as a bulwark against Russia, against Russian efforts to expand into the Eastern Mediterranean. It was British foreign policy, come what may, to preserve the sick man of Europe. But his opponents became inflamed, outraged. Gladstone led a public campaign which roused England and the Protestant nonconformist conscience. And Disraeli was accused of carrying out a Jewish policy, not a British policy, a Judaic policy, a Hebrew policy. Why? Because today we might, find some difficulty in getting around this, but the Jew and the Turk, they're natural allies against the Christians. And a Jew prime minister is going to pursue a policy where the persecution and even massacre of Christians is okay, and against Russia because the Russians are persecuting Jews in their own empire. That was the reasoning, very convoluted and largely nonsensical. But it did not prevent many distinguished people, including academics and intellectuals in England, from pursuing this line. The future Regius Professor of Medieval History at the University of Oxford, E.A. Freeman, who wrote a number of books also about Ottoman policy, he was probably the worst, but not the only one, in attacking Disraeli as a Semite and somebody who would never understand and was doing everything he could to oppose the interests not only of Britain, but of Christian and Aryan Europe. And he used those terms. So this kind of vocabulary had infiltrated into Britain. In fact, in his private correspondence, Freeman never referred to Disraeli by name. He only referred to the Jew. The Jew. And another Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford, a Canadian by origin, Godwin Smith, a liberal anti-Semite 100%. I mean, his writings matched those of any continental anti-Semite of that period. He too was absolutely incensed by the fact that the British Empire had been taken over by a man whose whole outlook and approach to policy was solely in the service of Jews. One thing one should add, just in parenthesis, is that Disraeli, in a way, had left himself open to this, not by his policy, but by a number of literary works in his earlier career where Jewish themes are very extensively discussed. And perhaps unusually for a convert, we can say that Disraeli had an extraordinary racial pride in his Jewishness. If you read Tancred, Coningsby, David Alroy, you see that Disraeli was convinced that the Jews were not merely a chosen people and unique, and that they run the world, as the anti-Semites like to say. He really believed this, and he wrote it down. And there are protagonists, particularly Sidonia in Coningsby, who talks about the fact that there is this race that secretly, the Jews, who are in fact running the finance and the politics and the culture of modern society. He did this in a positive way, but the anti-Semites continued to quote Disraeli as source material for a long time. Nevertheless, having said that, one thing needs to be said. By and large, most conservatives at least, do accept Disraeli as the founder of modern Tory democracy, which indeed he was, and recognize that his leadership probably saved the Conservative Party by adapting it in his own way to the modern world. And so Disraeli, we can say, is a very ambiguous figure to this day. But there is a certain affection, a certain respect, conservative leaders, and also in the popular mind. He was associated with empire, associated with Queen Victoria, Empress of India, and so on and so on. The anti-Semites saw this as a disaster. I want to come more to the modern and contemporary period. And in particular, to look at developments as they have occurred in the last, I would say in the last 30 years in particular. I left England in 1980. And just before doing so, I had an interesting personal experience which has stayed with me, of having a future mayor of London, whom I'm sure that you've heard of, Mr. Ken Livingstone, Red Ken, actually coming and knocking on my door. I was living at that time in Lincroft Gardens in West Hampstead. And he came and knocked on my door. He was canvassing for my vote. And he was an up-and-coming Labour politician. And I invited him in for a cup of tea. And we had a discussion. And there were two things that stuck in my mind. He asked me what I was doing. I told him I'd just begun, actually, teaching at University College. And it was my first year. This was 1979. And he asked me what I was interested in, what I was writing about. And I said, well, there are two themes that really interest me right now. They still interest me. One is anti-Semitism. He frowned. He didn't look very happy about that. And particularly left-wing anti-Semitism. And he looked even more displeased. And Trotsky. And then he really beamed. He lit up. Because in 1979, I wrote a sort of intellectual biography of Leon Trotsky. And also a play, a radio drama that the BBC actually broadcast. It was the 100-year anniversary of Trotsky's birth, 1979. So we had a chat about Trotsky, and he was absolutely enthralled by anything, you know, any little detail. He was a groupie, a Trotsky groupie. And when I came back to the question of left-wing anti-Semitism, which was what I did my doctorate about, so I knew something about it. And one of the points I remember bringing up was that the British Labour movement, and this bears directly on what we're discussing, the British Labour movement doesn't seem to have ever recognized, let alone made any minimal mea culpa for the skeletons in its own cupboard. And I listed a few things, such as the late 19th century, that the trade unions in Britain were militantly opposed to Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, that this policy continued through the 20s and 1930s. He hadn't heard anything about this. I mentioned the Boer War, Britain's last great imperial conflict, highly controversial. There was an inflammation of left-wing anti-Semitism in Britain during the Boer War, led by distinguished MPs like John Burns, by trade union leaders, by intellectuals, economists, even liberals like John Hobson, who presented the South African War as a Jewish conspiracy of German Jewish cosmopolitan bankers who had taken the British Empire by the scruff of the neck and had actually engineered a disastrous war. No, he hadn't heard anything about this, And as far as he was concerned, on the whole issue of immigration, it was a question of conservative politicians, which is true. They also oppose. In fact, the point here is there was a kind of consensus between conservative governments, such as Balfour's government, but the governments of the 30s, and the trade unions, to keep the Jews out as far as possible. And then we got into something by which time he must have realized there was no way I was going to vote for him. Because I got into Ernie Bevin, you know. And that's when I didn't realize at that time, I have to say I had no idea of the extent to which Livingstone was an out-and-out anti-Zionist. And he was careful, after all, he hadn't totally given up, I guess, on my vote. So he didn't come out with everything, but Bevin. I said then what I would say now and swear by it, that Bevin was 100% anti-Semite. Once I had a row with Tom Segev who said, no, he was just an anti-Zionist. Ben Gurion said so. I said, well, I don't know, have you read any of the real, material? You don't have to go to Ben Gurion to decide whether Bevin was an anti-Semite or not. How about Richard Crossman, for starters, who was very close to Bevin, who was put on the Anglo-American Committee for Palestine because Bevin thought he would probably be sympathetic to his position? And Crossman said that by 1947, if not earlier, that Bevin was absolutely intoxicated with the idea that there was a Jewish conspiracy to bring the British Empire down, that they were agents of the Soviet Union, that the Zionists had absolutely no place in Palestine. And of course, there were all the public statements. Bevin said, what are the Jews doing after the Holocaust? He said this, yes. What are the Jews doing pushing their way to the head of the queue? I mean, there's lots of evidence. James MacDonald, who was the first American ambassador in the new state of Israel, on his way to take up his position here, stopped in London. And he recorded his meetings with Bevin. And he was flabbergasted to see this torrent of rage that Bevin, sorry, I almost said Begin, that Bevin came out with against the Jews, against Israel, against the American president, Harry Truman. So there's no question about it. But the British Labour movement to this day, it was true in 1979, it's true today. They do not relate to anti-Semitism. It's something which I think has been buried very deliberately, to the point that this very recent decision made by the Academic Union of British Academics, the very last decision they made after reaffirming once again their boycott. Yeah. I mean, this has gone on for year after year. This is unique in Britain. There's no other country where it's gone so far. There are other countries where there are some signs of it, but their last decision was to reject a certain definition of anti-Semitism put forward by the European Monitoring Organization. It's really a common sense definition that, among other things, says that people who consistently compare Israel to Nazi Germany are in fact engaging in anti-Semitism. They went out of their way to pass a special resolution negating this, which means that anti-Semitism is the only prejudice which is considered by British academics or those who represent them to be something that the people who are most affected directly by it have absolutely no right to decide what constitutes anti-Semitism. We, meaning the Academic Union, are deciding, and they don't do this with regard to any form of racism. And if they decided what was considered Islamophobia or anti-black prejudice, etc., I mean, the whole world would erupt. They would never dare, not for 1 second, to envisage something like this. But this is considered quite normal. Today, the trade union movement in Britain has adopted the policies and the narrative of the Palestine Solidarity movement. Yeah, it has a slightly different name. The PSC.
The UN. Coalition.
No, there is an organization in Great Britain, PSC. Yeah, that's it. Palestine Solidarity Campaign. They are the umbrella organization that channels and organizes all anti-Israel activity in the UK. They are very efficient. I mean, if we had something as efficient as that, we would do a lot better. And they have targeted not only politicians and elites and the wider public, but particularly the trade unions, and they've been successful. Today, the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, which represents roughly about 6 million British workers, is more or less taken up the PSC line. And that includes, let there be no mistake, it's nothing to do with the borders of Israel in the 1967 lines. The PSC wants the return of all Palestinian refugees. Everything before 67 is up for grabs. The most recent, for instance, decision by Britain's Prime Minister, David Cameron, to resign from his position as a sponsor of the Jewish National Fund may have had something to do with the pressure coming from organizations like the PSC and the people that they have effectively convinced, because he's the first British Prime Minister who has done this in the long history of the Jewish National Fund. The official reason of Downing Street was time constraints. But
How much time did he give to it?
well, indeed, there are time constraints, but still, the first Prime Minister, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair before him, were Prime Ministers of England, and there were no time constraints, it appears, that obliged them to do this. But a Labour MP earlier this year in Parliament, Jeremy Corbyn, who is a militant anti-Israel and anti-Zionist activist, he had welcomed a new campaign to against the Jewish National Fund, which is part of the wider delegitimization strategy in Britain that's been going on for a decade. And they've targeted the Jewish National Fund on the claim, and I saw part of the speech of Jeremy Corbyn. They targeted the Jewish National Fund because they claim that all the land that was bought up legally, that this in fact is built on the destruction of Palestinian villages, that all of this from their point of view is illegitimate and illegal, and it is not imaginable that a Prime Minister of Britain could be a sponsor of this. And this was said in the House of Commons, and a lot of pressure was building up on this issue, and this campaign will go on. It will go on. I'm pretty close to the end, right?
It's up to you.
Let me just add a few words about the boycott and then come to some remarks which I think encapsulate, for me, the climate of opinion in Britain today. I mean, there are hundreds of examples one could give, and some of them I've laid out in this text, and they've been widely commented on elsewhere. With regard to the boycott, of course, you may remember, this began around 2002. It began with the academic boycott. Not with a commercial boycott, not with a trade union boycott, although the academic unions representing university lecturers were involved very early on. And there were a number of incidents. I don't want to recount all of that. There was Professor Wilkie in Oxford University who refused an Israeli student on the grounds of his nationality and added that it was intolerable to him that Israel should, be claiming the moral high ground on the basis of the Holocaust when it was more or less perpetrating similar deeds, which is a refrain, of course, that we have heard thousands and thousands of times, and in Britain, as much as anywhere in the world, this has become a sort of cliche of our time. I mean, a particularly horrible one, and deeply offensive to Jews in particular, and a libel. At that time, it was initiated by an Anglo-Jew, Professor Stephen Rose and his wife, and it was followed up by The Guardian, lots of signatures, although it should be said that The Guardian, which is second to none in its delegitimization of Israel, at every conceivable opportunity, should be said that The Guardian actually was not too sure about the boycott and has reservations about it, even though it gave maximum publicity to those who were seeking to extend it. And then in 2005, we saw the first decisions actually being made. No doubt we can say it's a small group, and at first people were saying they're unrepresentative, they're activists who manage somehow to manipulate the indifference of many of the members. But we're way beyond that stage now. There have been many resignations in recent years of Jewish academics who tried to change things from within and discovered that there was no willingness to seriously discuss or debate any aspects of the policy towards Israel. The boycott is now, perhaps we should call it boycott, disinvestment and sanctions. That is an official policy. The only reason that it wasn't implemented de facto is because of the legal advice around 2007 that was provided, legal advice, that this was discriminatory under English law, and that there was concern about the implications financially of unions, academic unions, using their funds for these purposes. But nevertheless, it goes on. Despite the legal advice, this continues. And as I mentioned, the trade union movement, all the major unions, the Transport and General Workers Union, Unison, the National Union of Journalists at one point, other unions have followed. And that may get worse. So that boycott is a potentially very damaging, and that's what its purpose is. Let there be no mistake. The boycott is intended to damage economically, politically, in every way Israel, and it damages Anglo-Jewry as well. Obviously, there are immediate implications. And this really leads me to the last symptom of the deep malaise. There were many possible choices here, an embarrassment of riches almost, one could say, when we look for what has gone wrong. But I want to select a drama, 10 minutes worth of drama, 2011, are widely acclaimed in many circles, not by the Jewish community or by most sane people, but how many of them are left is another question. I'm referring to 7 Jewish Children by Carol Churchill. I hope, no relation. And, you know, this text, you can actually read it on the Guardian website. They even had a Jewish Passover meal to illustrate it. And, you know, the finger in the wine symbolizing the blood. This play, to me, reads a little bit like a modern version of the blood libel, as if we're coming full circle, with all the differences, obviously, in motivation and whatever, but there's something about anti-Semitism here of the power, the enduring power of certain tropes, of certain images. In this play, let me give you just a taste from the end of the play. We're talking about sort of anonymous Jewish parents, as it were, speaking to their children and reassuring them from the time of the Holocaust to Gaza, because this play is subtitled A Play for Gaza. So it's probably a mother speaking to her child, her Jewish child. Tell her about the army. Tell her to be proud of the army. Tell her about the family of dead girls. Tell her their names. Why not? There's nothing to be ashamed of. Tell her how they did it to themselves. Tell her that they want their children killed, to make people sorry for them. Tell her we're the ones to be sorry for. Tell her we won't stop killing them until we're safe. Tell her I laughed when I saw the dead policeman. Tell her they're animals living in the rubble now. Tell her I wouldn't care if we wiped them out. Tell her the world will hate us. Tell her we're better haters. Tell her we're chosen people. Tell her I looked at one of their children covered in blood, and what did I feel? Tell her I felt happy it's not her. And so on and so forth. What do we have here? Certainly not what the author and her supporters claimed, simply a statement of disagreement with Israeli government policy, not even anti-Zionism. In the whole play, the words Zionism, Zionists, Israel, Israelis are not mentioned even once. Only Jews. And it's called 7 Jewish Children. That's an important consideration. And here I want to quote, and with this I'll conclude, I want to quote an Anglo-Jewish author, his first name escapes me, Howard Jacobson. Howard Jacobson. I'm not going to quote from the Finkler question, although it is very funny and also very sad and tragic and dark. And I read it on a Greek island recently, which is a good place to read these things. And I want to quote rather, very briefly, from an article he wrote in The Independent, another newspaper which competes every day with The Guardian for, you know, the Israel Bashing Award. And nevertheless, they do allow Howard Jacobson from time to time to have his word. And I think his comment on Carol Churchill's play is very apposite, so I want to leave you with this. Once you repeat in another form the medieval blood libel of Jews rejoicing in the murder of little children, you have crossed over. It's the old stuff, Jew-hating, pure and simple. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Wistrich has asked me to comment on the response of Anglo Jewry to the current extraordinary upsurge of anti-Semitism. So I ask you to bear with me for 5 or 6 minutes, and I warn you in advance that some of you will maybe be somewhat angry at what I'm going to say, but I am not known to hold back with my feelings. Today, every Jewish community engaged in dealings with government feels challenged by the need to balance silent diplomacy and public action. Anglo Jewry, as a matter of deliberate policy, has a long tradition of maintaining a low profile, even extolling the effectiveness of Jewish action, based on, and I quote, whispering rather than, quote, shouting. The problem in the UK is exacerbated with a status awarded to anti-Israeli Jews who are increasingly being quoted approvingly in the mainstream media and frequently given greater prominence than the established Jewish leadership. In addition, there is a conscious or unconscious inclination by increasing numbers of Jews to adopt an anti-Zionist chic to distance themselves from the growing anti-Israelism which saturates the media, universities and all levels of society. This is brilliantly portrayed in the book referred to by Professor Wistrich, Howard Jacobson's 2011 Booker Prize novel, The Finkler Question, which satirically portrays an assimilated British Jew seeking to escape his Jewish heritage and integrate by turning against his own people. Last November, with British media hostility against Israel reaching an all-time high, this trend climaxed when Mr. Mick Davis, chairman of the United Jewish Israel Appeal and chairperson of its Unaccountable Jewish Leadership Council, publicly urged British Jews to be more critical of Israel. Davis made the bizarre statement, and I quote, "I think the government of Israel has to recognise that their actions directly impact on me as a Jew living in London, the UK. When they do good things, it's good for me. When they do bad things, it's bad for me. And the impact on me is as significant as it is on Jews living in Israel. I want them to recognise that." The Board of Deputies declined to criticise this outburst, and the London Jewish Chronicle actually carried an editorial praising the right of Davis to become, and I quote, Anglo Jewry spokesman for the view that the current Israeli government is on the wrong trajectory. The Israeli ambassador, Ross Prosser, found himself in the unprecedented position of being obliged to rebuff a senior Jewish communal official for challenging the morality and courage of Israeli leaders, alleging that Israel was losing its moral compass and in danger of becoming de facto an apartheid state. These are all quotes from Davis. Needless to say, no serious person denies the right of diaspora Jews to criticise aspects of Israel or condemn moral lapses by Israelis in public life. However, it's only until recently it was considered somewhat unconscionable for Jews living outside the Jewish state to exert pressure in relation to security policies which could have life and death implications for Israeli citizens. No other Jewish community, including that of the United States, whose Jews are considered far more liberal than their British counterparts, would tolerate such outbursts from a purportedly mainstream leader. Davis, after all, is head of the UJIA, not a spokesman for J Street. It is such a volatile environment that the well-intentioned leaders of the Board of Deputies are groping for solutions. But alas, their obsession with the merits of retaining a low profile, not rocking the boat, and determination to avoid confrontations does provide credence to accusations that they are frequently perceived as trembling Israelites. Together with BIPAC, a lavishly funded organisation commissioned to promote Israel advocacy, they seem to be continuously on the defensive, desperately seeking to prove their bona fides to the left, investing more efforts against marginal fascist groups than the far more threatening Arabs and anti-Israel far left. The leadership also dwells excessively on ritual condemnations against Islamophobia, but is reluctant to confront the leadership of the Muslim community for failing to condemn terrorism and extremism in its own ranks. Most alarming is the populist anti-Semitism in the UK is the fact that it is probably worse than the 1930s during the heyday of Nazi propaganda, because at that time you at least had certain liberals or leftists, for whatever reason, opposing Jew baiting. Today these groups, as has been pointed out by Professor Wistrich, at best are silent bystanders and frequently lead the pack in campaigns to demonise Israel and vilify the Jewish people. At the universities, the situation continues to worsen. Campaigns to promote boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel are the order of the day, and many Jewish students are intimidated by the aggressiveness and violence of pro-Palestinian leftists and Arabs. Yet even in these instances, the communal leadership urges restraint. A few months ago, a Jewish student handing out pro-Israeli pamphlets was brutally attacked, bitten on the face and hospitalized. Instead of supporting him, the executive director of the Jewish Leadership Council claimed that the student had brought upon himself, and I quote, "If they go looking for trouble, they really shouldn't be surprised if this sort of thing happens," he said. The Conservative British government appears to be even more hostile to Israel than its Labour predecessor. And as was pointed out by Professor Wistrich, in March this year, Prime Minister Cameron delivered a major speech to the Jewish community. No, he didn't say that. He gave a major speech to the Jewish community, extolling its contributions, condemning anti-Semitism, claiming that his belief in Israel was indestructible, and even describing himself as a Zionist. Yet despite all bloc, and that was exemplified by the Jewish National Fund issue, which was covered previously. I think it's important to realise that whilst initially claiming that the move was made to ease Cameron's workload, the Jewish Chronicle itself subsequently reported that a spokesman in the Prime Minister's office had confirmed that the reason for withdrawal was the JNF linkage with Israel. But the editor of the Jewish Chronicle described the Prime Minister's decision, and I quote, "the equivalent of sticking two fingers up to the Jewish community of Britain," end of quote. With the exception of a statement by the Zionist Federation and the UK branch of the JNF, Anglo-Jewish leaders responded to this affront with deafening silence. Yet true to form, last week, Mick Davis, chairman of the UJA, and his colleague George Ronson, head of the Communal Security Trust, the organisation created to combat anti-Semitism, last week did speak up. They immediately dissociated themselves from a UK JNF condemnation of the move as capitulating to pressure from extremist anti-Israeli groups. In what can be defined as grovelling, they provided Cameron with a total clean bill of health, describing as ridiculous the suggestion that the decision to step down had anything to do with pressure from anti-Israeli groups or reflects a negative opinion on Israel, because the Prime Minister is, and I quote, "a staunch friend of Israel." Today, at a grassroots level, some British Jews, and even a number from leadership ranks, are becoming fed up with the attitude of their spokesman, who they accuse of being in denial by excessively downplaying the extent of the anti-Semitism and demanding more vigorous responses to anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli onslaughts. And this has been manifested by protests from rank and file representatives at the Board of Deputies and the adoption of a much more assertive tone by the British Zionist Federation. The British Coalition for Israel, a new body primarily promoting pro-Israel advocacy, has received enthusiastic support from wide sections of the community. Despite, and I'm concluding on this, the escalating level of anti-Semitism in the UK, the primary battle must be to ensure that a generation of new leaders will emerge from within the Jewish community who have the courage and conviction to stand up and defend its interests. If those who bury their heads in the sand and fail to confront the forces demonising and delegitimising Israel carry the day, it will have a catastrophic impact on youngsters whose self-confidence is being undermined as they observe their elders running for cover. If anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli libels are not confronted, the younger generation will undoubtedly absorb the false Palestinian narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which portrays Israel as a rogue state, born in sin, occupying Arab territory and denying Palestinians their basic human rights. Thank you. Now, we're going to have questions that Judge Bach asked to start, and I'll be very happy to give him the floor. I'm going to ask everybody to be as short, as brief as possible, as the hour is late.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for most illuminating and fascinating lecture, although not a very pleasant and rather sad one. But still, it was really very, very interesting, and we all learned a lot of facts that we didn't know. I also would like to hear perhaps your reaction to what Mr. Library has now said. I wanted to ask you actually only two questions in connection with the blood libel that you mentioned about this child. Is there any connection between that story of the killing a young Christian child that you told, William, and the story which was perhaps a little bit different time, but it was spread all over Europe, in Poland and Russia, about killing, that Jews kill Christian children in order to take the blood and to put it in the matzot for Pesach and for Passover, and that this is the reason. I mean, this was the story which was spread afterwards in the protocols of the elders of Zion. And I mean, all these anti-Semitic stories which were spread afterwards, before that, I don't know, maybe at the same time, but a little bit later in Russia, Poland, and in other places. Is there any connection? And was such a story of the use of the blood of these children also used in England? And the second question in that connection is, do you really think that, I mean, it's difficult to make an estimate, but that you really think that young people in England today still believe in this blood libel in any way? I don't know. My feeling was that the great majority will never have heard of that at all. I mean, just like I think that 99% of all Israelis have never heard of that story. And I somehow don't think, I mean, there is this feeling against Jews and the stories about Jewish corruption, and then the feeling sometimes about Israel, and that the connection between that and anti-Semitism, that is there. But I think that, I mean, this old story, which where you gave us the details, do you still think that a large or a certain appreciable number of young people in England still believe in that, and or whether that is something that is part of history?
Now, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very, very much for such an interesting lecture. Very sad, though. I come from England. I lived there most of my life. Recently, I heard that if there are Muslims in a police force, they're not obliged to defend Jews should they be in any trouble. You go around the Jewish community and they try and hide their Jewish identity. Synagogues are locked and with security. It very much reminds me of what happened in Europe in the 1930s. What's next? And when would the Jewish people wake up there? I feel they live in denial.
Thank you.
Yeah, firstly, there was no mention of the Swedish blood libel.
We're talking about England today.
Yeah, no, I know, but we're talking about the blood libel and the students on campus. This was a recent issue where it was still coming up, where it was very much students on campus in Britain who said, is this true? So this is the first thing. But you spoke about the British history, and it seems to be replicating around the world independent of this history. I'm wondering if you can give thoughts on that, where the Labour movement in particular globalises without the particular British history that's behind it.
I thank you for the additional remark you made after the professor spoke about
Questions now.
Yes, I have a question. And it's directed to Professor Reister. Where do the English get the chutzpah to talk about, one, brutal occupation, and two, an inhuman naval blockade, and three, refugees? They themselves were the most inhuman occupiers of Palestine from 1917 to 1948. The second thing is their inhumane boycott, naval blockade, kept millions of Jews out of Palestine, trying to save their lives. Three, they rounded up every refugee that managed to reach Palestine and deported them.
Thank you.
Where do they get the chutzpah to say this?
Thank you.
What the questions were. British chutzpah, not quite the word, but let me take the substance of what you said. If we look back on the history of the mandate, from 1917 to 48, strictly speaking 1922 to 48, several things should be quickly pointed out. In the years between 1917 and 22, the British military administration, this is well known, was extremely hostile to the whole concept of the Jewish national home and did as much as it could to incite the Arab population against Zionism. Not that they needed that much incitement, but the British in Palestine generally, when there were Arab riots involving loss of life, and that began in 1921, were very slow, very, very slow to intervene. This happened elsewhere in the Arab world later, when Jews were massacred, as in Baghdad, 1941, and then after World War II. The early years, I think, were not so bad, the 1920s. And things began to turn sour, really, from 1930 on. Hope Simpson report was really a slap in the face to the whole notion of the national home. And by 1939, as you all know, the White Paper was a complete negation of the whole purpose of the British mandate. And this is a point I would like to emphasize because I don't think it's sufficiently underlined. Great Britain received the mandate for Palestine from the League of Nations. And if you examine both the 1920 San Remo Declaration and the 1922 terms of the mandate, the only reason that Britain was given the mandate was to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. So that was a solemn legal obligation under international law. What Britain did in 1939, and to me that's more important than the other aspects, in the long term, is that it turned its back on its obligation to the international community. It actually was an infraction of international law, which is now one of the major charges, especially in England, but elsewhere, against Israel. So Churchill pointed this out. He was in opposition, and he denounced this as a complete betrayal of Britain's commitments. However, when he was in power, one of the most powerful British prime ministers of the 20th century, if not the most powerful, he did not reverse the British White Paper policy, which would have strangled the Jewish national home. That was absolutely clear. Britain's intention after World War II was basically to have, although they didn't say it publicly, to have a Palestinian state with a Palestine Arab majority and a 1/3 Jewish minority, and to maintain their position in the Middle East as a result of that. That's why they do not collaborate, or cooperate's the word, with the UN partition resolution, and that explains a lot of their policy between 45 and 48. My indictment of British policy would be more with regard to 45 and 48, although the 1930s, late 30s certainly, shutting off of immigration in the 39 White Paper. During the war, yes, this has been studied, it's been detailed, how Britain's policy was basically to avoid any steps to rescue the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. The issue for the Foreign Office was, what the hell will we do with these Jews if we do some sort of deal with the Nazis? That's what worried them above all. Give you one example. Take the Bermuda Peace Conference, not Peace Conference, but it was a Bermuda Conference in April 1943. And Britain and the United States made a deal there. Palestine was, of course, off the board, as it was at the Evian Conference in 1938, where a similar deal had been made between Britain and the US. the purpose was to remove some of the pressure building up from below in both countries as the news of the Holocaust was becoming more widespread. It wasn't called the Holocaust, but people knew the Jews were being slaughtered in Europe. They didn't want to do anything. There was absolutely no question of Britain or the United States at that point intervening in any way to help the Jews of Europe. That only changed with the establishment of the War Refugee Board in the US, when British-American policy begins to diverge. And that continues after World War II. The indictment 45-48 is very clear. It's not only that Britain would have, if it could, have aborted the establishment of Israel, which it could not, but it hoped that it could. And the indictment is also that even after the Holocaust, nothing changed. British white policy paper did not change. The Labour government, which was in power, was the worst of all governments in the whole history of this subject. The Attlee-Bevin government, in terms of its practical policy towards the Jewish survivors, and not only in Palestine, in Britain, Bevin put his foot down. Only 5,000 Jewish survivors were allowed into Britain after 1945. In that period of time, Britain had an acute labor shortage, and they issued 600,000 work permits. And they allowed, I'm talking about the 40s, late 1940s, and about 350,000 of those came from Eastern Europe, Gentiles. And some of them were Nazi war criminals, and some were collaborators. It took years for this to come out. But they put their foot down that Jewish survivors of the Holocaust would not be admitted. And that's even into Britain. I know because my parents came in 1948, and I know what they suffered in Britain in the first years. That was Home Office policy, but foreign policy was just as bad. So, yes, there is certainly an indictment which needs to be made much more vigorously, because Britain has a good conscience vis-a-vis the Jews. And that's part of the reason, I would say, that some of this poison that has been coming out now for years is so easy. Because people, when confronted with even a part of this story, they're astounded. Ordinary British people say, yes, but we stood alone against Hitler. And we intervened to save the Jews. We fought Hitler. This is the kind of myth which is a total inversion of the truth. We fought Hitler to liberate the Jews, because there are these pictures of Bergen-Belsen, British Army comes in, liberation of the camps. But of course this is utter nonsense. The actual policy was quite the reverse. And British intelligence were better informed than anyone else in the world about what was going on with regard to the Holocaust. They even suppressed some of the material from Churchill. So, yes, there's a great deal that could be said, not only about the mandate, but in general, about these years of 1930s and 40s. I was asked a question relating to the present. A very important point here, which I think you touched on, is that the Jewish community in Britain is obliged out of its own pockets to spend vast sums of money to ensure communal security. It's not only the locks on the synagogues, it's the guards, the policemen that have to be paid. You're stopped if you want to go. It happened to me quite a few times. Stopped and interrogated by policemen if I wanted to go into a synagogue in London. And there is a sense of considerable anxiety, which obviously has a basis with regard to everything from terrorist assaults, and we know synagogues, communal figures, leaders have been targeted. So far these plots have been foiled. usually by Muslims. You mentioned Muslims, gives me a chance briefly to mention something which I've written about, but is really impossible to ignore. Britain today has close on 3 million Muslims. Among those Muslims, albeit a minority, a militant minority, mainly from Pakistan, you have people who are violently anti-Semitic in a way that belongs much more, as it were, to the Muslim world, even though they are educated in Britain, have gone to British schools and sometimes universities. And here we're talking about conspiratorial anti-Semitism, we're talking about protocols of Zion type of materials, jihadi, semi-genocidal and sometimes openly genocidal anti-Semitism. And this is very scary. And of course, this is taken more seriously. Since 7 July 2005, Britain was extremely lax for many years regarding homegrown Muslim terrorism, and anti-Semitism was seen as just a small blip, you know. I presented some material years ago to British parliamentarians about this, and that was before the terrorist attacks in London. And yes, they listened and so on, but they were not prepared to see any need for a change in policy. They said, we've got these people under observation, which was true, but that didn't count for much. I think this is the most serious short and medium-term danger to the Jewish community physically. But the real danger comes from the shifts in the majority society and in the elites. We're talking about academic elites. We're talking about the churches today. I didn't mention that. But you know, among the supporters of boycott, you've got the Methodists, you've got many of the Anglicans, you've got an Archbishop of Canterbury who thinks it might be a good idea to introduce some aspects of Sharia law into Britain. He's mixing in politics, and more recently got into hot water, I noticed. But the Anglicans are really no use whatsoever as far as the idea of, you know, Jewish-Christian relations having entered into a new era. I would say they've regressed in recent years in Britain, and part of that is the Anglican leadership. So we have many problems there. And we haven't mentioned the media, and I'm not going to get into the BBC at this point, but the damage, I think, over many years, the drip, drip, drip of really poisonous misrepresentation of Israel in particular is something that has long-term consequences that we can't fully fathom, but we've seen enough to see the general direction. A judge asked me about the blood libel. I think you may have misunderstood something with regard to, first of all, what I was asserting about the blood libel carrying through. What I meant was a more metaphorical and literary influence. I don't imagine for a moment that if you did a poll of Britishers today, they're going to say, oh yes, we believe in the blood libel, and we're quite convinced. They may well not understand what the blood libel even is about. But let's take an example from cartoons. In 2003, there was this cartoon by Dave Brown that appeared in The Independent, which showed, it won the Cartoon of the Year award, and it showed Ariel Sharon eating a Palestinian baby, you know, really eating it, while there was the vote Likud, you know, blaring out on a broadcast, and Apache helicopters overhead, and the whole paraphernalia. Now, what's going on here? Eating children, eating babies. This is the way it carries through. The Israeli army is perceived, not only in Britain, of course. This I could give many examples, and I do in my book, from around the world and in Europe. But the Israeli army is perceived as basically a child-killing machine. This is a blood libel, but take it in the broader sense of the term. It doesn't have the specific Christian connotations of the Middle Ages, but it's a libel. That's why I quoted Howard Jacobson at the end, because he, as a literary person, he sort of understood that a text like Carol Churchill's text, whatever her intentions, it doesn't really matter in the end. I can't look into her mind and say, is she being honest when she says, of course I'm not an anti-Semite? It doesn't really matter. I could give you so many examples, particularly in Britain, of anti-Semites who are indisputably recognized as such in British history, who vehemently denied that they were at the time. So it's not a criterion that somebody says, of course I'm not an anti-Semite. It's not a criterion. But that cartoon plays into all of this background. Without that history, I don't think it would have the resonance. What did the cartoonist say? I was inspired by Goya, by the painting of Goya about Saturn devouring his children. Well, yes, that's wonderful, by all means. But why did you choose Ariel Sharon? And why is it a Palestinian baby? And the editor of that newspaper, The Independent, is, of course, a Jew, Simon Kellner, who vigorously defended this cartoon as absolutely kosher from the point of view of being free of any hint of anti-Semitism. So that's what I would say on that point. One other thing, though, that might interest you in a broader sense. According to surveys made, and I can't vouch 100% for these surveys, across European societies, regarding percentages of people who believe that the Jews killed Christ. The average, I must admit, it surprised me somewhat. The average was something like 22% of Europeans believe this. And Poland came out top. We would talk about 39%, right? But Britain was 19%. So 1 in 5 of Britishers, according to this survey, actually believe the Jews killed Christ. So this, even in a society that all commentators agree today, Britain is very secular. Not many people go to church. Today, the number of Anglicans who go to church is about the number of Muslims. And the Muslims are 3 million, and there are 60 million Britishers. So that tells you something about how secularized it is. And yet, you see, these cultural symbols are very powerful.
What about Christ? Many people here will still believe that. I think that there is a lot of argument going on about that, even inside the Israeli community.
About what?
About Christ. What happened really about, there was the famous lecture by Chaim Cohen, where he said, that was a kind of revolution, where he said the Jews were really not responsible, but
no, well, I'm talking about believing that the Jews killed Christ, but Israelis don't think the Jews killed Christ. I've never yet met an Israeli Jew who thinks the Jews killed Christ. It's not an academic debate. This is fundamental to the culture of the country. All the people I went to school with, I think if they were pressed to the wall, a majority of them probably would say, of course, because that's what they heard every day at the assembly. That's what's in the New Testament. The Jews killed Christ.
Yeah, hi. I'm Adam Levick. I manage the SIF Watch. We monitor The Guardian for anti-Semitism. You mentioned that The Guardian is second to none in delegitimizing Israel. Can you speak briefly on what the driving forces of that are, and do you think radical Islam in the UK is a driving force?
Next to the microphone.
Right. My name is Karen Sethill. I work at the British Council. Our job is to promote trust and understanding between Britain and Israel. In particular, we're promoting Britain as welcoming students and academics from Israel. Are we wasting our time?
Okay. Next. One question. One word question.
Can you just speak directly to the question of whether the call for a boycott in and of itself is anti-Semitic?
Right. Next. That's it. Last one.
Thank you for an illuminating speech. I was wanting to, obviously it's about anti-Semitism, but in that I wanted you to just speak briefly about the fight against anti-Semitism. You quoted popular literature and its important role keeping anti-Semitism alive in England. Where do you see, and you say that the PSC is very successful in influencing the popularity, is very popular. How do you see a role in popular literature in being able to also win the middle ground in educating again about very complex issues?
Thank you.
I can't say, to what extent popular literature today is going to have any influence, certainly not in the short term. It never works in that way. But I do think the media, the mass media, have an enormous influence. And on the whole, that's been pretty disastrous, as I hinted at. But I want to just add one little qualification. It's an irony, it's a bitter irony in this rather painful story. Namely, the only part that I detect in the British media that is reasonably fair towards Israel are the tabloids. And I'm not a great fan of the British tabloids. But if I pick up anything from the Daily Express, which is probably the high end of the tabloids, to the News of the World, or worse than that, which I don't want to mention, when they choose to deal, because there's a major conflict in the Middle East, they show some understanding of Israel's predicaments. And no doubt, although they would never say this, no doubt, because they view the Muslim world and Muslims in general with great suspicion and, I would say, distaste, they understand Israel's problem even more. And that's a fact of life. And it's sad because you would expect that intelligent, thinking people, and The Guardian was alluded to here, that they might choose to see both sides of the coin as one of these sort of elementary things that we always told that universities and so-called intellectuals are supposed to be doing. And this actually doesn't really happen. So that's one point. A second point, I don't know why you mentioned Christian socialists. Who were you thinking of?
You touched upon it basically in terms of their impact as far as Zionism and as far
Oh, I
as
see what you mean.
anti-Semitism.
Christian Zionists. That's something else.
No,
Not
Christian
socialists.
And
Yeah.
any connection.
Okay,
with
because
that.
you asked about Bevan, who was a Welshman. And I don't know all the details about whether he too had some kind of Christian background. What I would say on that point is that I do see Tony Blair as being the last of that line of basically pro-Zionist British politicians where the connection with religious belief is very important. Blair was the most religious-minded British politician we've seen in a very long time. He kept it under wraps for a long time because it would not have been good for him. He converted, as you say, eventually. His wife is a Catholic.
Right.
But I think his Christian belief was one factor in motivating a sort of gut sympathy and understanding for Israel in terms of its whole raison d'etre. Why is Israel here? You know, the proposition to someone like Blair, you know, to have the presumption to speak for him now, is to say, if he hears Israel stole the land of the Palestinians, which is almost like the bottom line of 95% of the kind of things that are churned out now on the left, that would appear to him grotesque, I'm quite sure. I presume to speak for him now. And I think that if you're a Christian, you understand, or you're more likely to understand, the connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. So that's what I say on that issue. I was asked about, I don't know why Sweden came up really in this context.
It was about British students, whether they could still believe in blood libel. I said when the Swedish thing happened.
Yeah, well, what you say would not totally astonish me, because I think here we're dealing with an almost abysmal, boundless ignorance. We're talking about ignorance of history. We're talking about ignorance even of, certainly of the origins, genesis of the Arab-Israeli conflict, ignorance about Islam, ignorance about Jewish history per se, ignorance about the Bible, ignorance about the foundations even of English culture, for that matter, and English history. So, yeah, ignorance, of course, is a very fertile soil. And in the universities, I think we can assume nothing, because the impact of the popular media is such that students today, what they're coming with, the baggage they have, is such it's almost like a tabula rasa, and you can write anything on it. So that is one of the givens that we have to take into account also strategically. There was a question about, I think you asked about, can you just remind me?
The Guardian.
Yeah.
Monitor the Guardian for anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I want to know your thoughts on what's the driving forces intellectually
Okay.
there.
Yes. Driving forces intellectually, I'm tempted to say that the intellectual part we could dispose of to begin with. Because it seems to me that what we're talking about, it's a very fashionable term now in France and Spain. We're talking not so much about intellectual driving forces, we're talking about indignation, a sort of very dispersed, a sort of emotional outrage, indignation, that doesn't seem to be very focused, but can sometimes fixate on a subject such as Israel. You know, there was this ludicrous pamphlet that appeared in France not long ago and sold millions of copies, called Indignez-vous, you know, by, I won't go into the specific details of it, but there are some very, very nasty passages in this 20-odd pages, which became a bestseller by a distinguished French citizen who claims to be a partly Jewish ancestry and used that in order to clobber Israel, among other topics. And he appealed to this rather diffuse sense of indignation. Now we see in Spain, in a different context, with all the very understandable protests of hundreds of thousands of young people who are unemployed, who are now labeled as the indignant ones. And I think a lot of the anti-Israel ferocity that we see also has this sort of, it's indignation. Indignation about what? As if Israel is a criminal state, it's the world's #1 serial violator of human rights. It is a monstrous entity. Even Nazism doesn't do it, you know, in terms of what's supposed, and this repetition, constant recycling, which the internet sort of accelerates and intensifies, creates this almost relentless snowball effect. And I don't see much intellectual, intellectuals are involved in it, yes. That's one of the appalling facts of our time, that the extent to which intellectuals actually feed it, the Chomskys of this world, lend their name to it, believe in it. And I don't think, actually, this is a really sad conclusion to come to, but, what can you do? You have to state the facts as they are. It's absolutely pointless not to do that. And reasoning with these people, I long ago discovered, even though I continue to try and do it through my writing, is actually futile. There are only a handful of people you can reach that way. Maybe you can say, that's important in itself. Yes, I agree, it's important. But we have to realize that. Therefore, monitoring, we have to monitor, we have to analyze, we have to go on with our work, we have to persist in it, believe in it. I certainly wouldn't waste years writing a encyclopedia if I didn't think there was some value in it. But it is, I have no illusions, absolutely none. I was asked the question about whether the boycott is intrinsically anti-Semitic. I would answer you this way. First of all, as a historian, I would say that the boycott has been one of the favored tools of Palestinians, one of the favorite tools of anti-Semites through the ages. I did a lot of work on the late 19th century, anti-Semitism in Europe. I was very struck by the fact that in most of the societies where anti-Semitic movements evolved, developed, from France, fin de siècle France, through Austria-Hungary, including Slovakia, Poland, also among the German Austrians, and Germany itself, from the mid-late 19th century right through to the Nazis. The boycott was a primary tool, economically, politically, of anti-Semitic movements. And of course, none of us can ever forget those pictures, those images from Nazi Germany. Kauft nicht bei Juden. Do not buy from Jews. And those stormtroopers standing outside of the Jewish shops in Berlin and elsewhere and smearing the sign of Jude and so on the windows. It's a classic tool of anti-Semitism. Now, that's not accidental. When we look at the boycott today, with all the differences between then and now, you have to ask the fundamental questions. What is the purpose of a boycott? The purpose of a boycott is to, I said it before, to damage Jews, damage them economically, damage them politically, underline their exclusion. It's an exclusion. The moment you boycott, you are excluding. We're saying we want no dealings with Israel. We're saying Israel is an illegitimate entity. If we say we want no dealings with it, and this is the only country, on top of that, this is the only country, not China, not any part of the Arab world, not Iran, and not any number of states that are really serial violators of human rights. No, they are not to be excluded. Not Syria, which is massacring its own population as I speak, and so on. Nobody's talking about a boycott of Syria, as far as I've been able to ascertain, but Israel and a Jewish state, and no academic exchange, no commercial exchange, ultimately no kind of exchange. The people who are calling for it, whether they know it or not, they don't generally want to go into this because it's unpleasant and it might just put them in a very defensive position. So of course there will be no discussion of this aspect of it. In the history of anti-Semitism, Boycott is one of the key weapons in the history of anti-Zionism. It's emerging as one of the key weapons. The Arab League, the Arab states boycotted Israel from its foundation, even before. And consistently, they were never really brought up on it until the United States passed some legislation forbidding American companies to comply with the boycott. But in the United Kingdom, there was no such legislation. And in fact, in most countries, there isn't. And that is part of the Arab world's warfare against Israel. The boycott was a win. The fact is, it failed. And actually, Israel, if anything, perhaps we could say retrospectively, was strengthened by it, but that's neither here nor there. The purpose was not that Israel be strengthened, but that it be damaged. And so I think in that respect, it's clearly anti-Semitic, even though, from a purely theoretical point of view, you might perhaps make the argument that in and of itself it's not anti-Semitic. I think a more grey area is the question of apartheid. See, there I think that you could make a case, I personally wouldn't make it, but I could envisage a case being made where you say to brand Israel as an apartheid state is not in itself anti-Semitic. I abhor and totally disagree with the definition of Israel as an apartheid state, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's anti-Semitic. And it's interesting that the Community Security Trust in Britain, which assesses very rigorously what is an anti-Semitic incident and what is not, does not include graffiti or other aspersions on Israel as an apartheid state as anti-Semitic in its very rigorous accounting. It does include descriptions of Israel as a Nazi state. That's interesting. They actually make such a distinction. But I do think boycott is a weapon of preference of anti-Semites, and that's a very important fact to take into account in this issue.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry that we haven't got more time. It's run away. We should have stopped. But please, we all...